Most people think they know how the Soviet Union collapsed. They imagine a dramatic moment, a sudden failure. One day it existed, and the next day it was gone. But here's the uncomfortable truth. By the time the Soviet Union officially collapsed, for millions of people, it already felt dead. Not destroyed, not conquered, just hollow. Life still looked normal from the outside. Jobs existed, the government functioned, the flags were still there. But inside the system, something had quietly snapped. People woke up every day, went to work, followed the rules, and yet felt like they were running on a treadmill that never moved. Effort didn't lead anywhere. Doing things right didn't change outcomes, and no one could clearly explain why. What's disturbing is this. There was no single moment where everyone said, "Okay, this is the collapse." There was no alarm, no clear signal, just a growing sense that the system was no longer responding to reality. And that's the part that should make you uncomfortable. Because the most dangerous collapses don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with explosions. They arrive with normality that slowly stops making sense. Here's why this matters to you. Most people assume collapse is loud, obvious, impossible to miss. But what if the real warning sign isn't chaos, but routine? What if the moment a system becomes truly dangerous is when people are still showing up, still working, still complying, even though deep down they know something is wrong? Because that's exactly what was happening. People weren't rebelling, they weren't panicking, they were adapting. And adaptation can hide decay for a very long time. That's why almost no one noticed the Soviet Union collapsing in real time. Not because they were stupid, but because collapse didn't look like collapse. It looked like life getting heavier, slower, more disconnected from effort. And once that pattern starts, it doesn't stay in history books. It repeats, quietly.
Here's the strange part. If you talk to people who lived through the last years of the Soviet Union, most of them don't describe fear. They describe confusion. They say things like, "I couldn't tell when it stopped working. It felt normal, but heavier. I thought maybe I was doing something wrong." And that's important. Because when systems break loudly, people panic. But when they break quietly, people blame themselves. They think, maybe I'm not trying hard enough. Maybe everyone else understands something I don't. Maybe this is just how life is. So they adapt. They lower expectations. They stop planning long term. They focus on getting through the week, the month, the year. And from the inside, that doesn't feel like collapse. It feels like personal failure. That's why almost no one stood up and said, "This system is dying." Not because they were blind, but because nothing clearly told them it was allowed to question it. And if that sounds familiar, you're not imagining it. This is what slow collapse feels like. Not chaos, but uncertainty without an explanation.
Most explanations stop too early. They'll tell you, it was mismanagement, it was corruption, it was bad leadership. And sure, all of that existed. But here's the problem with those answers. They don't explain the pattern. Because if collapse were just about bad leaders, changing leaders would fix it. If it were just about corruption, purging a few officials would reset the system. But that's not what happened. Things didn't snap. They didn't reset. They didn't improve after reforms. They just stayed heavy. Year after year, and that tells us something uncomfortable. Whatever was happening wasn't a single mistake. It was something baked in, something structural, something that kept working the same way no matter who was in charge. That's why people couldn't point to the exact moment it went wrong. There was no announcement, no single law, no dramatic turning point. Just a slow realization that effort no longer changed outcomes. And when effort stops working, people don't immediately rebel. They wait. They adjust. They assume the explanation will come later. But what if the explanation was never meant to be obvious? What if the system didn't fail, but evolved into something else entirely? Let's pause for a second. Because here's the good news. This isn't as complicated as it feels. What happened didn't require secret meetings, or one genius plan, or some hidden switch flipped overnight. It followed a structure, a very recognizable one. And once you see that structure, a lot of confusion suddenly disappears. We're not going to jump around. We're not going to drown this in dates or ideology. We're going to walk through it step by step. First, how stability is built. Then, how it quietly shifts. Then, why that shift doesn't look like collapse at first. And finally, why reversing it becomes so hard. No politics, no heroes, no villains. Just incentives, systems, and pressure. Because when people say the Soviet Union collapsed, they imagine an ending. But what actually happened was a long transition that most people didn't recognize as collapse until it was already irreversible. And that's the part worth understanding. Not because it's history, but because once you recognize the structure, you start noticing the same signals elsewhere. Here's the story most people are told. That the Soviet Union collapsed because people stopped caring, bureaucrats became lazy, leaders made bad decisions, and the whole thing just fell apart. It sounds logical, and it's comforting, because if collapse comes from stupidity or laziness, then it feels distant. It feels avoidable. It feels like something other people do. But that explanation doesn't survive contact with reality. Because effort didn't disappear. People still worked. Factories still ran. Scientists still innovated. Engineers still solved problems. The system didn't suddenly lose intelligence. What it lost was alignment. The system slowly stopped rewarding the behaviors that once made it stable. Doing your job well mattered less. Following the rules mattered less. Producing real value mattered less. What started to matter more was access, connections, position, and survival inside the structure. And once that shift happens, collapse doesn't need chaos to begin. It can start quietly, while everything still looks normal. This is the part people miss. Systems don't collapse when people stop trying. They collapse when trying no longer works. And once effort stops being the path to stability, people adapt. Not loudly, not rebelliously. They adapt quietly. They optimize for survival instead of contribution. They play defense instead of building. They stop believing the future belongs to them. From the outside, it looks like apathy. From the inside, it feels like realism. And that shift from belief to resignation is one of the earliest signals that something deeper has already changed. At first glance, the Soviet collapse feels unique. Different ideology, different politics, different time. That's why it's often treated as an exception, a strange historical accident that doesn't really apply anymore. But when you strip away the labels, something uncomfortable appears. The sequence feels familiar. A system that once worked, stability that felt permanent, rules people trusted, effort that made sense. And then slowly, those same rules stop producing the same outcomes. Not overnight, not with a single decision, but through a series of small shifts that feel rational at the time. This is where history becomes useful, not as dates or names, but as pattern recognition. Because when you look closely, you start noticing that collapses rarely begin with empty shelves or public panic. They begin much earlier, at the moment when incentives quietly change, when the system stops rewarding contribution and starts rewarding survival inside the structure. That moment doesn't make headlines. It doesn't feel dramatic. It feels technical, administrative, boring. And that's exactly why it's so dangerous. Because by the time people realize what's happening, the pattern is already in motion. If you look back far enough, the pattern starts repeating. Not in ideology,
but in structure. Take late imperial Rome. On paper, Rome still looked powerful. The borders existed. The institutions functioned. The laws were enforced. But beneath that surface, the economy was hollowing out. The currency was quietly debased. Taxes rose, but services didn't improve. Work mattered less than proximity to power. People didn't panic, they adapted. And that adaptation is what locked the system in place. Jump forward. In imperial Spain, centuries later, the empire was flooded with silver. Money poured in from the New World. Yet instead of strengthening the economy, it masked structural weakness. Production declined. Debt exploded. The state survived on future promises, not present strength. Again, no sudden collapse, just pressure accumulating where people couldn't see it. Then France, before the Revolution. A highly centralized system, heavy state control, endless borrowing to preserve stability. Life didn't collapse overnight. It tightened. Bread got harder to afford. Opportunity narrowed. Confidence eroded. Different countries, different centuries, same sequence. A system that depends on control instead of adaptability. Debt instead of productivity. Stability instead of resilience. And every time, the warning signs looked mundane. That's the part history makes clear. Collapse doesn't announce itself. It normalizes itself. The tools change. The outcome doesn't. Rome used coinage. Spain used silver. France used paper promises. Britain used financial markets. The Soviet Union used something else entirely: central planning, state guarantees, fixed prices. But the mechanism underneath was familiar. When a system prioritizes control over feedback, it loses the ability to correct itself. When stability becomes more important than reality, errors stop being fixed, they get hidden. In the Soviet Union, production targets mattered more than usefulness. Meeting quotas mattered more than efficiency. Reporting success mattered more than telling the truth. So the numbers looked fine. The reports looked fine. The system looked stable. But stability wasn't coming from strength, it was coming from suppression. Bad information didn't flow upward. Failure didn't get acknowledged, and adaptation became politically dangerous. The result wasn't chaos, it was stagnation, a slow suffocation of flexibility. And that's the pattern. Different tools, different language, same structure. When systems remove pressure in the short term, by force, by debt, or by control, they also remove the signals that keep them alive. By the time reality pushes back, the system has lost the muscles it needs to respond. That's why collapse always feels sudden, even when it's been building for decades. This is the moment where systems stop feeling neutral. When systems like this start to stagnate, not everyone loses. Some people actually do very well. Not because they're evil, not because they planned the collapse, but because the system protects them by default. In the Soviet Union, the winners weren't innovators, they weren't productive workers, they weren't problem solvers. They were the ones closest to allocation. If you controlled distribution, you controlled survival. If you had access to state resources, connections, or administrative power, you weren't exposed to shortages the same way. When goods became scarce, your position mattered more than your effort. Food didn't disappear evenly. Housing didn't collapse evenly. Security didn't vanish evenly. It concentrated. And the system quietly learned to protect itself. Bureaucracies don't collapse easily. They adapt to preserve their role. When production failed, paperwork grew. When reality got worse, reporting got smoother.
When trust eroded, control increased. The system rewarded loyalty over truth, compliance over accuracy, silence over correction. And the people inside that structure, even as everything decayed, still had food, shelter, status, and insulation. This is the part most collapse stories skip. Collapse doesn't start with chaos. It starts with separation. A growing gap between those who feel the pressure and those who are shielded from it. And as long as that gap exists, there's no urgency to fix anything. Because from the inside, the system still works.
And this is where most people enter the story, not as observers, but as participants. Because the people who absorb the damage aren't abstract groups. They're not statistics. They're not the economy. They're the ones who did what they were told. They worked. They planned. They delayed gratification. They trusted that effort would translate into stability. And slowly, that equation stopped working. In the Soviet Union, this wasn't dramatic at first. It was subtle. Salaries existed, but bought less. Jobs existed, but led nowhere. Rules existed, but didn't protect you. People didn't collapse. They adapted. They lowered expectations. They stopped planning long-term. They learned not to stand out, not to complain, not to expect progress. And that's the real cost of a slow collapse. Not chaos, not riots, but resignation. When effort stops moving you forward, people don't rebel immediately. They disengage. They stop believing the system is for them. That's why collapses like this are so dangerous. They don't feel like emergencies. They feel like life getting quietly heavier every year. And here's why this isn't just history. Because systems don't need to collapse completely to stop serving the people inside them. They just need to reach a point where working harder no longer changes outcomes. So the real question isn't, why did the Soviet Union collapse? The real question is, how many people lived inside it for years feeling exactly like this before anyone admitted what was happening? And if a system can survive that long while quietly draining the people holding it up, what does that say about systems today?